In this video, we're going to talk about a functional approach to language, which is the theoretical understanding of language that guides the Gibbons text that we're reading in this course, and also is the way that I approach language and language teaching. Now, as you read about in the Gibbons text, a functional perspective on language is rooted in a theory developed by Michael Halliday, who is a British linguist who spent most of his career in Australia, and he developed systemic functional linguistics, or SFL, in the 1970s as a way to think differently about language. And as Mary Schlepper-Girl defines it, a functional perspective of language is this. Rather than seeing language as a set of rules, the functional linguistic perspective sees the language system as a set of options available for construing different kinds of meaning. So a functional perspective on language means we focus on what we use language to do. It sees language as a set of choices, different choices that a speaker or a writer can make in order to communicate different kinds of meaning. So that's at the core of a functional understanding of language. Language is not just grammar rules, it's not just nouns and verbs and thinking about how we structure those nouns and verbs and phrases and clauses to make meaning, but it's really about what are we using language to do to communicate that meaning? Language then is a meaning-making system from this perspective. And Michael Halliday argued that language varies according to two contexts: the context of situation, or the immediate context, and also the context of culture. So let's start with the first one, the context of situation. And here I'm providing some of the terms and concepts that you've been reading about so that we can then apply them to thinking about writing and to the language of schooling. All right, so the context of situation includes these three components according to Halliday's work. What is being talked about? For example, if I were to say, I like the ones in the window, the ones with the higher heels. You might, if I asked, what am I talking about? You can probably surmise that I'm talking about shopping for shoes. I'm pointing out some shoes that I like. Or in this sentence, magnetic attraction only occurs between ferrous metals. You might infer that I'm talking about magnetism, right? And this is maybe something you would see in a textbook. So this is called the field. What is being talked about? That's one component of the context of situation, how we use language to make meaning. Another component is who is participating in the conversation, or the relationship between the speaker and listener, or the reader and writer. So this shapes the language choices that we make. So for example, if I were to give you this sentence, hello, how can I help you? You might be able to predict that who is participating in this conversation are two people who don't know each other, right? It's fairly formal. There's no, they're not saying, hey, or how's it going? There's no names. It sounds like an interaction that might happen between a shopper and somebody who works at the store, or someone who's in a position where they're offering service or assistance to somebody. So we might say that these people probably don't know each other. If I give you this sentence, hey, it's great to see you. Now the who is participating in the conversation, the relationship has shifted. It sounds like these two people might know each other. Hey is more informal. It's great to see you implies that they've seen each other before. So we can see now that this relationship is different. This is called tenor. This is what Halliday calls tenor, the relationship between the speaker and listener, or the reader and writer. And the relationship changes the way that we use language. And the final aspect of the context of situation that Halliday identifies is how the language is communicated and organized. So if you see LOL like that, you probably would assume that maybe that is communicated in a text, right? That's usually how we see that language communicated. First, I went to the store, next day at a restaurant, finally I came home. This is organized very much like something written. We don't often talk like that. And it sounds like a student perhaps practicing writing a procedure, writing a recounting what that student did that day. So Halliday refers to this as the mode, or it's how the language is organized, or what mode is being used, whether it's spoken or written or something in between to communicate the language. So he argues that all of these three things work together to shape language choices that are made according to the context of situation. I make different choices in terms of what I'm talking about, how I'm saying it, and how I'm organizing my text, or what mode I'm using to communicate based on these three things and the context of the immediate situation. And together, Halliday says that these can be talked of or these comprise the register. And we often talk about a register being more formal or more informal. So the second example under field has a more formal register. This example here, hey, it's great to see you, has a more informal register. So these three elements working together form the register. All right. And this just gives you another visual of language varying according to the context of situation and how that's structured. So every text is embedded within the context of situation. And text can be spoken or written. So the word text he's using kind of broadly there to mean any language that's being used has these elements that shape the choices that we're making. All right. And this is an example I sometimes have students do in person, where I have them think about what they did over the weekend and pretend that they're talking to different people and how it changes the field, what they're sharing, the tenor, the relationship, and how it shapes the language choices they're making. And the mode usually remains the same because they're speaking, so that doesn't change. But you can see through this exercise, if you want to try it yourself, that you probably make different strategic language choices based on just shifting the audience, just shifting the person that you're communicating with. All right. In addition to context of situation, language varies according to the context of culture. All texts are shaped by the cultural context in which they are produced and interpreted. And so that's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the texts that are used at schools. So more broadly, how to appropriately greet someone varies in the context of culture. When I was living in Santiago, Chile, I had to learn that to greet someone appropriately meant kissing on the cheek or touching cheeks. Not something that I do now that or very frequently, now that I'm back living in the United States. Handshakes are much more common, or even just a wave. So how to greet someone is an example of the context of culture. How to write a formal letter is different depending upon the cultural context that you're working in. In some contexts, it's more appropriate to write a much more effusively warm and to use many honorifics and to show your gratitude to someone. In the context of US formal letters, that would look very odd to show that kind of effusive gratitude. So it depends on the cultural context. How to write a text message also shifts depending upon the context of culture. And how to write a report, an argument, a fictional narrative, procedure, that also operates within the context of culture, because schools are one such culture. We do things, we write texts in particular ways when we are at school, and in ways, as we were just looking at with that recount, that you might never use outside of a school context, right? And so students need to learn these school-based genres to be successful, but we need, I think, first to understand that these genres, these ways that we're asking students to use language, are operating within a specific context of culture or school culture. All right, I'll give you a couple more examples just to help with this concept of field, tenor, and mode, because I know that can be kind of tricky. So this is an example of a Facebook post that one of my friends posted after she learned how to make paprika. So you can see from the post, the field is making paprika. She was learning how to make it from scratch, apparently. The tenor is friendly and casual because the audience is her Facebook friends. So she might not know everybody, but it definitely has a more I know you tone because she's talking to her friends. And the mode, it's a Facebook post, so we can see that it's written here. The register, we would probably argue, is pretty informal. Here's another example of field, tenor, and mode. So here we see a science textbook page. And if you look at it, you can kind of skim through it and see it's about cells. So the field is types of cells. The tenor, the writer does not know the person reading it, right? It's a textbook author writing this for a middle school student. So that the relationship is one of, two people who are not ever going to meet, but the textbook author has a middle school student in mind. And the mode is it's written as a textbook. And the register, though, here, unlike the Facebook post, is more formal. We can see different language that's used, more complex grammatical structures and organizational patterns because it's a printed textbook. All right. So in summary, as we kind of move forward now with this approach in mind, a functional approach to language argues that writers make strategic choices to accomplish the purpose of a text within a given cultural and situational context. So that is the heart of this approach to thinking about language, and it's one we're going to use throughout this week as we think about applying it to writing instruction specifically. Okay, I'm going to skip over that. And we're going to move into the genres of schooling. Jim Martin, Joan Rothery, and others began to apply this concept to writing in the 1980s in Australia because they were seeing, as I mentioned in the first video, that students, multilingual learners especially, but many students were struggling to learn how to write. And so they said, let's see if we can develop a way to think about the language of schooling from this functional perspective. And what they developed, and what many have since continued to work on, is they started to identify the different genres that are used at school and think about how they're organized, the language features that are part of those genres, and then from there, how you could teach them so that students could be successful in writing those in those genres. And I want to be clear here that when functional linguists say genre, they're not just talking about literary genres, or they're not talking about literary genres like fiction, nonfiction, poetry, drama. They're using the word genre to refer to a text type. Any text type that shares a common purpose, a common organization, and common linguistic features would be considered a genre. And I'll give you some examples of those, and you also read about them in the chapter, one of the chapters for this week. So this is the way that Pauline Gibbons groups some of the different genres that Martin and others have written about, and they're the ones that are commonly seen in schools. So some of the genres that students engage with at schools, both in reading and writing, are creative or personal genres. Recounting, so kind of telling the story of something that, or not a story, but recounting, telling the experience of something that happened to you. Narratives, which are stories, right? And they often have a narrative arc with a climax and a resolution, and they tell a story to entertain the reader, or sometimes to teach the reader a lesson. Factual genres, which include reports, which are organized into different subtopics about a main topic. Explanations, which explain how something happens, or the steps of something like a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. So anything that's a cycle or anything that involves a process would be an explanation. So here you see an example of a mentor text, who made my lunch from milk to ice cream, showing how ice cream is made. So that's written in a different format than a report. Procedures, on the other hand, give specific instructions of how to do something. We often see procedures in science class that are giving kind of step-by-step instructions. Recipes are an example of a real-life procedure that we often see outside of school. And then finally, analytical genres, which include arguments, where a student is writing essentially a persuasive piece from one perspective, trying to argue that perspective, or a response in which students are writing an evaluation of something. The most common responses that we see in our real world outside of school are reviews of movies, reviews of books, that it's anytime we're kind of responding to or analyzing, evaluating something that we've engaged with. So these are some of the examples of the genres that you might encounter at school. And it's important, again, to think about from a functional perspective, it's all about the purpose, right? Why are we writing this? And then we start to think about the way it's organized and the different language features that enable it to accomplish its purpose. But at the heart of this perspective is a focus on purpose. And that helps guide our understanding of what these different text types are designed to do. So a personal recount, a biography, and a fictional narrative all fall within the same general purpose, which is to tell a story. They have different sub-purposes within that, but in general, they're all telling a story. The purpose of a report and an explanation are also grouped together to give information, one to inform and one to explain how something works or came to be. A procedure gives instructions, an argument persuades, and a response is responding to or analyzing something. And so we can see how the purpose of all of these different types of texts varies, or areas where they're similar, and that helps us to think about how we want to organize the text and what language features we would use in order to successfully write the text. And I wanted to point out that report and explanation are sometimes grouped together. They both are kind of in this factual genre, but as you can see, one is giving information in kind of a categorical way, and the other one is giving information in sequence. So they're organized differently. And biographies are sometimes grouped with these as well because they're nonfiction, but biographies are telling a story. And so they're written in a totally different way. Their structure often follows a story structure. It's written in the past tense. So there's a lot of differences, even though we often group them together. So you can see the nuance we gain by approaching the genres of school from a functional perspective, as opposed to approaching them by looking at fiction or nonfiction. Or by even the common core categories, which tend to conflate genres together that have really different organization, sentence, language features, and sometimes really different purposes too. All right, so in the Gibbons chapter, she gives you some examples. I just wanted to walk you through how you can use the charts that she provided to help understand the different genres of schooling. So one example she gives is a personal recount, which again has the purpose of telling a story, and its specific purpose is to tell what happened. So that one example topic might be our class excursion or our class field trip, and it's organized in these different stages. So it begins with an orientation, telling who, what, when, and where. Then it goes into a series of events, and then it often ends with some kind of personal comment or conclusion. And students are often not explicitly taught this structure, right? So you might see students who just launch in with a series of events, but they don't give you that orientation, who, what, when, and where, which is really important when we're giving a personal recount. So you can see how explicitly teaching these stages could be beneficial to students. All texts have different ways that the ideas are connected. In the case of a personal recount, the connectives have to do with time. We use words like first, then, next at the end of the day to structure time. And then some of the other language features you might see are the past tense, telling what happened, action verbs like left, arrived, ate, went, and then words to describe the people, events, and actions. So this gives us a clear idea of what to expect when we're writing a recount. A procedure, on the other hand, you can follows a really different, has a different purpose, different stages, different language features. A type of procedure or an example of a topic might be how to make paper cranes. The purpose is to give instructions. You can see the stages involve the goal of the procedure, the materials, and then usually followed by the steps. Some connectives are that you see the steps numbered, but they aren't typically given in narrative form. And you might see other language features like imperative verbs, specific adjectives that are used to describe materials, and adverbials or adverbs and their associated phrases, which are specifying different actions. So you can see that if we engage in this analysis for different genres, we're going to learn different things about how to organize them, their purpose, and the language features we might encounter. All right, so that is it for this video. In the next one, we're going to talk about how we can use this understanding of language and of the genres of schooling or the different text types in school to be more intentional about our writing instruction for all of our students, but especially for multilingual learners.